What if the government trailed your grandmother while she was in her 20s? What if they listened to her phone calls and wrote notes and saved those notes? What if you could go to the library and find out where she went and what she did? If you could find out all of those things, would she be the same person she was when you knew her? And if she wasn't, would you really want to know about it? Hi, I'm Shan-Yi Balogh. I'm the author of Her Kind of Luck, a biography about my extraordinary step-great-grandmother, Shan-Yi Balogh. She was a teenage runaway, a suspected spy. She was a world record holder for the longest ever round-the-world trip in the 1950s, and she lived a truly adventurous life. The book is also a memoir about my personal journey, battling depression, and finding my way through my 20s. I've had a few author talks cancelled in the next couple of months because of the coronavirus outbreak, so I thought I'd just give a short remote talk to keep you guys entertained and tell you what it was like to discover a version of my grandmother that I had never known. I was 24 when Shan-Yi passed away, and after her death I moved into her apartment. I was struggling with mental illness and feeling quite lost and trying to figure out who I was. Even though at that time I was asking a lot of questions about who I was meant to be and my future, the longer I was there, I found myself asking more and more questions about who she was in the past. Later, when I started to really research, I would go on to learn how strangers saw my grandmother. But first of all, I was able to see the world through her eyes by living in her home and reading all of her letters. She kept copies not just of the letters that people sent to her, but of carbon copies of all the letters she sent to others, which made an incredible diary of her life. I'm going to read a little excerpt from my book about that time. For a while, I missed the hidden clues, the answers to questions that I never knew to ask. I was too busy fussing and cleaning, too distracted to search for buried treasure. I fitted my possessions around Shan-Yi's, only using a couple of rooms. It was as though I were house-sitting, living tentatively so that everything would be just so when she eventually returned. But after a while, I started to dig in. Kneeling on the hallway floor, I used a ruler to wedge open the curved door of a sideboard. It was the first time I had even noticed the door was there. The furniture was so heavily embellished that it was nearly impossible to tell where drawers opened and lids lifted. Swinging the door aside, I uncovered a collection of recording equipment, a portable radio, oversized headphones, and a cone-shaped microphone that looked like it had been around since the 1950s. I couldn't imagine what Shan-Yi would have used this technology for. I suppose these things must have been Andrew's, although I couldn't guess how they factored into his work as an importer. I had no way of finding out. I had never even known the man. In one room, I uncovered a drawer full of aeroplane eye masks, another of soaps from international hotels, another of individually packaged toothpicks. It was as though my great-grandparents had been preparing for some sort of toiletry-specific trade embargo. The deeper I dug, the more I found. Secrets and treasures that weren't just concealed by the sheer volume of possessions, but which had been hidden on purpose. Some bookshelves had false backs, panels that opened to reveal a cavity hiding a silver tea set or important files. Old books piled up on a cupboard proved to be hollow, concealing crystal shot glasses and a bottle of scotch. In a tiny ceramic saucepan the size of a thimble, I found a message scrawled on a scrap of paper, $5,000 in white handbag. I turned the dressing room upside down, but the white handbag was nowhere to be found. There were hundreds of photo albums filled with artworks in black and white. Shan-Yi in 1936, wrapped in a fur coat, silhouetted against the pale grey of the Taj Mahal. Hanging off a yacht in Sydney Harbour, hair braided like Heidi, smoking in a broad bamboo hat. Coquettish, posing in bed, a kimono draped over her chest, long black hair fanning across a pillow. In the years since her death, I have read hundreds of letters written by Shan-Yi. They were piled into boxes in her study, and it took me weeks just to sort and catalogue them. I have a folder here. This is just letters written between Shan-Yi and her son, my grandfather Alban, between 1940 and 1975. I have about 10 or 15 of these folders. Sometimes I can hear Shan-Yi's voice when I read her letters. Other times they don't sound like her at all. The grandmother that I knew was curt and brash. Sometimes I can recognize that sassiness in her correspondence. But the woman who wrote many of the letters was sentimental and emotional, someone who was able to communicate deep feeling and wore her heart on her sleeve. When I ultimately started to write the book, I worried that extended family members would read it and think, this isn't Shan-Yi, she wasn't this soft. But there was another side to her, one that I didn't know during her lifetime. This is a letter that she wrote to a close friend during World War II, shortly after she began her relationship with my great-grandfather, Andrew. My divorce becomes absolute within a few months now, and I shall marry again almost immediately after. It is not the tempestuous and selfish love I once knew. It's not a thing, really, about which I am able to write much at all. I only know I love him too deeply ever to let him down, and too wholly for anything else to ever enter my heart. Quiet words and small words. Yet it seems to me that the greatest love can promise no more than this. Not only is that gentle and lovely, it was really useful for me to read at a time in my life when I was making really toxic choices in my love life, some of which I've written about in Her Kind of Luck. In many of her letters, Shan-Yi wrote things that were so emotive and sentimental and sweet that I can't imagine her having ever said them to anyone face to face. She was able to combine the signature wit and sharp tongue that I knew so well with vulnerability, describing times in her life when she was anxious or lonely or afraid. Whether she was being funny or tender or stern or a mixture of all of the above, Shan-Yi always wrote detailed and beautiful letters. Growing up with Shan-Yi, I knew that she was a musician. She was a classically trained violinist, but I never thought of her as a creative person, even though I thought of myself that way. The reality that she wrote so well and was so clearly creative is one of the reasons that I was able to write so richly about her life. This letter is from 1953. It describes the experience of flying with Andrew. Many a time I have looked out of a plane onto a world of rose-tinted clouds, golden in the sun, been ecstatic with its beauty, and then struck cold with horror at the knowledge that that fantastical loveliness is completely unsubstantial, and that all that world of nothingness lies not above me, as surely the good God intended, but below. I know that at such moments, the slightest darkening of those innocent clouds or the faintest presage of a storm would reduce me to chattering idiocy. Andrew, sensitive in all other matters, regards this idiosyncrasy with utter incomprehension, murmurs something inaudible about the need for psychiatric therapy, and changes the topic. The Shan-Yi I met through her letters was so much more openly vulnerable than the great-grandmother that I knew. Meeting this sensitive woman made it even more of a shock when I learned how ruthless and cold she appeared in the eyes of the authorities, from the perspective of neighbours and friends, police and detectives. I found a Sydney Morning Herald article from 2012 that described her as an alleged femme fatale. Everybody saw her differently, and many people saw her as a threat. One of the main reasons that Shan-Yi drew the attention of Australian intelligence services during World War II was her race. She was Chinese, and her first husband was German, a combination that seemed strange to the authorities. She was a beautiful, intelligent woman, and that was inherently threatening to the establishment. And her life, evenings spent around the European neighbourhoods of Potts Point and Elizabeth Bay, drinking cocktails with friends and playing cards, didn't fit into the white Australian suburban lifestyle. Very suspicious stuff. It was shocking to discover how much information had been collected about Shan-Yi and filed away by the National Archive in Canberra. The archive was able to digitise much of the material I requested, and at the click of the button, I could find out all sorts of details about her personal life. It was wild how much I could learn about Shan-Yi by visiting libraries. I read scenes about Shan-Yi and Andrew that would make a grandchild squirm. Their apartment was bugged, and detectives sat upstairs listening into their conversations and taking notes of whatever they could make out. Some of the parts that made me most uncomfortable were the periods of silence. Let's just say that I'm probably one of the only people who've read their great-grandparents' pre- and post-coital chat. The version of Shan-Yi that I was introduced to through intelligence records was duplicitous and sinister, in no small part because she was popular with men. One letter, written by a business associate to the police, described her as a definite menace to the country. An intelligence report described her as a cunning woman who makes use of any men that are considered useful to her, could be classed as very immoral when it suits her. This woman has been the subject of many and varied investigations, but to date has been able to keep her head above water. Of course, she seemed to be able to keep her head above water because, as far as I could tell, there wasn't actually any evidence of wrongdoing. That said, their views snuck into my impression of Shan-Yi, complicating my memories. It seemed that the further I delved into her life story, the further I travelled from Shan-Yi the person. The great-grandmother who came to watch me in the school musical, who grumbled about the long drive down to the south coast and liked to eat Sasha Tort from the cake store in Rose Bay. But whenever I'd start to have doubts about my journey into Shan-Yi's history, I'd come across something exciting. Perhaps not exciting from a dramatic storytelling perspective, but exciting to me as a granddaughter. An opportunity to see my grandmother as a person my own age. This is an intelligence report from 1944. When this report was written, Shan-Yi was 27, and when I read it, I was 25. At about 3:30 p.m. on the 20th of April 1944, Miss Alice Lee Mayer, that's Shan-Yi, was seen to leave the Hotel Metropole in the company of Miss Daphne Curtis and another unknown woman. The party stood at the entrance to the hotel for some minutes and then entered an orange-top taxi number 2079. As it was thought that this would be of interest to this section, it was decided to keep them under surveillance. The taxi was followed up Bent Street to Macquarie Street and then to King's Cross, and eventually the party alighted at Denmark Flats, Wolseley Road, Point Piper. The taxi driver was later interviewed and stated that the conversation in the cab was purely of a personal nature and mostly about obtaining rice. He said during the conversation Christian names were used, and the only name he could remember was Margot. She was my age, going to lunch with her best friend Margot Adams, riding in a cab and talking about buying rice. She was riding down streets that I knew, in neighbourhoods that I've lived in. Shan-Yi's life, migrating from China to America to Australia, running away as a teenager and taking all sorts of crazy risks, was so different from my life. But in fragments of intelligence notes like that one, we were exactly the same. I could read the criticism and the suspicion, but mostly I just saw a woman like me, much as I had done when I read her letters. Shan-Yi has been part of my life since I was born, literally. This is a picture of her holding me as a newborn. When you've known someone that long, when you've seen them every Christmas and birthday for every year of your whole life, you have a sense of knowing them completely. Of course, the truth is we don't, particularly when it comes to our parents and grandparents who lived entire lives before we were born. They love us so much that they let everything revolve around us, and we get so comfy in that space that sometimes we forget to find out about the lives they lived before we came along. At times, it felt like I was learning too much about Shan-Yi, as though I might lose the grandmother I had known my whole life and replace her with a fascinating stranger. That's a scary thought, but the deeper I dug, the more humanity I found, and the more I loved her for it. So thank you for hanging out with me, guys. If you enjoyed this talk, please share it. And if you're interested in learning more about Shan-Yi's incredible life or about my personal journey, please go grab a copy of Her Kind of Luck. It is available to order online and for home delivery. So if you're looking for a self-isolation read, it will come to you. It's available from most Australian stores online and internationally as an ebook. As you can probably tell, it would be a great Mother's Day present. So go grab your copies and I'll see you soon. Thank you.